The Wyoming mountains do not forgive. They stand above everything, and they watch without opinion.
Once the money changes hands, Mercer, the matter is settled. The debt is settled. Nothing else.
Gant will not accept losing what he believes belongs to him. Did he do this to you? He had men do it.
The mountains had watched men lie before. That night, the weather came down to hear the truth.
Stay near the back room.
I will stay where the evidence is.
The morning Callum Mercer paid $50 for another human being, he told himself he understood darkness. He had killed men at Gettysburg. He had watched boys younger than his youngest brother drown in Virginia mud screaming for mothers who would never come. He had carried the weight of those faces up a Wyoming mountain and built 4 walls around himself and called it living. 7 years of deliberate quiet. 7 years of proving to himself that a man could exist without needing anything from the world beyond salt pork and ammunition and the particular mercy of a winter that asked no questions. He was wrong about understanding darkness. Real darkness, he would learn, did not announce itself with cannon fire and battle drums. It did not arrive on a battlefield with flags and formations and the terrible clarity of 2 armies deciding something. It wore the face of a father. It smelled like cheap whiskey and 3 days without bathing. It stood outside Garfield's feeding grain on a cold Tuesday morning in October of 1873 and offered a man something no human being should ever be offered, in a voice so practiced with shame that the shame itself had worn smooth. Callum had come down from his mountain cabin outside Harwick for the first time in nearly 5 months. The list in his coat pocket was simple: salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, ammunition. The kind of list a man makes when he has stripped his life down to its essential parts and decided the rest of the world can manage without him. He had written it by candlelight the night before, not because he needed the reminder, but because the act of writing a list felt like proof of intention, and intention was something he had to manufacture carefully these days. The ride down had taken 2.5 hours. Soot knew the trail well enough to navigate it without much guidance, which gave Callum time to observe the mountain making its preparations for winter. The aspens had gone fully yellow. The creek at the halfway point was running lower than it should have been for October, which meant the summer had been drier than it looked from up high. The first hard frost had hit the lower slopes sometime in the last week, killing the last of the wildflowers and leaving the meadow grass the color of old straw. By the time Harwick appeared in the valley below, he had been alone with his own thoughts for long enough that the sounds of the town felt like a different language. Wagon wheels and horses, and the particular percussion of a blacksmith working at full effort, and the layered voices of people going about business that intersected and diverged without any of them noticing. He tied Soot to the post outside Garfield's and stood for a moment, just letting the noise settle around him the way you stand in a cold creek until your feet stop registering the temperature. He was reaching for the door when he heard the voice. Desperate voices carried a frequency Callum's body recognized before his mind did. Something in the pitch of it. Something in the way the words came out too fast and too compressed, like a man trying to fit everything important into whatever time remained before the answer was no. He had heard that frequency in field hospitals and in the moments before charges and in the faces of men who had used up all their other options and arrived at the last one. Please, just hear me out. I'm asking you to just hear me out. Callum did not turn around immediately. He finished reaching for the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the latch. He had learned in the war, and in the years after it, that turning toward desperate voices often meant becoming responsible for the desperation. He was not in the market for responsibility. He had come for salt pork and lamp oil, and he had a list in his pocket that proved it. But he turned anyway. He always had. The man standing behind him was somewhere in his middle 50s, though hard living had done its efficient worst to make him look past 60. He wore a coat that had been good quality once, perhaps a decade ago, now missing 2 buttons and carrying the particular dullness of fabric that had been worn too long without proper washing. His hands shook with the fine involuntary tremor of a man whose body had learned to depend on something that was killing him one careful increment at a time. His eyes were pale and restless, always moving left, always checking something over his shoulder, as if whatever he was afraid of might arrive from that direction. The smell reached Callum next. Stale whiskey soaked into clothing over days rather than hours, and beneath that, the sour note of fear sweat, and beneath both of those, something worse. The particular odor of a man who has made his decision and is living in the few moments before he has to act on it when the self-hatred is at its most concentrated because it hasn't yet been converted into action. Callum did not know his name yet. He would learn it soon enough. Not interested, Callum said. You don't even know what I'm offering. Don't need to. The man stepped closer, closer than strangers should stand. Callum's right hand moved without deliberate thought toward the knife on his belt, and the man saw the movement and stopped, but he did not step back. He held his ground with the particular stubbornness of someone who has already lost everything that stubbornness might have protected. I have something valuable, the man said, something worth considerably more than what I'm asking for it. Move along, $50. The man's voice cracked on the number, not with emotion, exactly more like the words themselves were breaking under the weight they were being asked to carry. $50 and she's yours to do with as you see fit. Callum went very still. In the war, there had been a moment before a charge when everything stopped. Not silence, because silence implied the absence of sound, and there was never silence on a battlefield. More like the world drawing breath. Every man who had been in real fighting knew that moment. The body understood that something terrible was imminent before the mind could assemble the specific thought. The hairs on the back of the neck, the slowing of time, the sudden hyper-clarity of irrelevant details. He felt that now standing outside a feed store in Wyoming on a Tuesday morning. Say that again, Callum said. My daughter. The man glanced over his shoulder, the leftward habit again, then back to Callum. His voice dropped to something that was barely above the movement of air. She's 20 years old. Healthy, strong constitution, never been seriously ill. Good with her hands, good in a kitchen, can sew and mend and manage a household. She doesn't cause trouble. Doesn't talk back. $50 and she's yours. The street sounds of Harwick fell away entirely. The blacksmith's hammer and the wagon wheels and the conversations of women outside the dry goods store all dropped into silence the way sound drops in the moments after a cannon fires, when the ringing in your ears replaces everything else. There was only this man and these words and the cold October air carrying them between them like something toxic. Callum's hand moved from his knife to the man's collar. He grabbed it and slammed the man back against the wooden post of the storefront with enough force to rattle the sign above them and draw a quick, startled look from a woman passing on the boardwalk 20 feet away. You drunk son of a... I am serious. The man didn't fight back. Didn't grab at Callum's wrist, or try to pull away, or make any of the defensive movements a man makes when he doesn't deserve what's happening to him. He just hung there in Callum's grip with his hands at his sides, and his eyes wet, and his face carrying the specific expression of someone who has run out of alternatives and knows it. I am completely serious. I need the money. She has no future with me. You can see that a man with a place of his own, with means she'd have food and a roof, and Callum tightened his grip. I ought to break your jaw and leave you in the street. Then do it. The man's voice was hollow as an old log. Won't change a thing. I've already put this offer to 3 other men this week. Somebody is going to say yes before Friday. The only question is whether the somebody is you or Fletcher Gant. Callum released him. Not because he wanted to. Not because the man didn't deserve considerably worse. Because those 2 words hit him somewhere below the ribs with the physical force of a thing that changes the shape of a situation beyond recovery. Fletcher Gant. Every man in Harwick County knew that name, and the ones who were new to the territory learned it quickly and filed it under the category of things you navigated around rather than through. Gant ran the largest cattle operation within 60 miles in any direction, which meant that Gant ran most of what actually happened in Harwick and the surrounding land, whether or not anyone had formally agreed to that arrangement. He had money and he had men, and he had the particular species of cruelty that grows in people who have never in their lives been made to answer for anything. Callum had heard stories about Gant and women, the kind of stories that circulated among decent people in the lowered voices reserved for things that everyone knows and no one addresses. Because addressing them requires doing something about them, and doing something requires a tolerance for consequence that most people find they don't actually possess when tested. You're lying, Callum said. He said it because he needed to say it, not because he believed it. I wish I was. The man straightened up, one hand going to his throat where Callum's grip had been. Gant came to find me 4 days ago. Told me if his whiskey debt wasn't settled by Friday, he'd take the girl himself. Said he'd been watching her for a while. Said she'd suit his purposes on the property. He looked at Callum with the eyes of a man who has stripped away every self-protective fiction and arrived at the bare fact of himself and found the fact unlivable but inescapable. This way, at least I come away with something, and maybe she gets something that isn't Gant. Callum stood on the cold street and looked at the man in front of him and felt the particular exhaustion of a person who came to town for salt pork and is now standing in the middle of something that has no clean edges. He thought about his mountain, the silence he had built up there over 7 years, stone by careful stone, until the silence was structural and load-bearing, and he had organized his entire existence around it. He thought about the list in his coat pocket. He thought about 5 more months of winter and the way the wind sounded through the pines at night when it was the only sound there was, and how that had been, if not happiness, then at least the reliable absence of this specific kind of weight. He thought about Fletcher Gant. "Where is she?" Callum said. The man pointed across the street. She was sitting on the long wooden bench outside the telegraph office, and the aloneness around her was not the ordinary aloneness of someone waiting for someone else or resting between errands. It was a different kind entirely. The kind that certain people carry with them like a climate, a fundamental separateness from the rest of the human world, as if an invisible barrier existed between her and everything around her, built not by others, but by herself, because she had learned what happened when you didn't have one. She was young, 20, the man had said, and Callum could see that. Small frame, but not fragile, the kind of build that suggests capability rather than delicacy. Dark hair pulled back in a braid that had been neat at some earlier point in the day and was coming undone now, not through carelessness, but through the ordinary entropy of a long day wearing on a careful arrangement. Her dress was brown and faded and mended so extensively and in so many places that it was more repair than original fabric. She was thin in the way that spoke not to illness, but to years of a table that never quite had enough on it. She was peeling an apple. That detail would stay with Callum longer than any other. Not the dress or the braid or the thinness or even the aloneness. The apple. The small bone-handled knife moving in slow, precise arcs. The long, continuous spiral of peel dropping to the ground at her feet without breaking. She was not hurrying. She was not watching the street. She was not scanning her surroundings for information about what might be coming next, which was the thing most people in uncertain situations could not stop themselves from doing. She was simply peeling the apple, with the focused, methodical attention of someone who has learned through long practice that the only reliably safe place to put your mind is on a task small enough to contain. "Her name's Wren," the man said quietly behind Callum. "Wren Voss. She's a good girl." Callum watched her for a moment. Then he said, "You mean you spent 20 years making sure she didn't cause trouble?" The man flinched. He did not deny it. Something moved through Callum's chest. Anger was part of it, but underneath anger was something older and more specifically exhausted. He had seen this particular configuration of human desperation before during the war, and in the years that followed it in the settlements and small towns and way stations he had passed through before the mountain. Human beings becoming currency. The math of desperation always arriving at the same denominator. He had gone to the mountain to be done with that world, done with its particular genius for finding new ways to do the same ancient damage. That was the whole point of the list, in the silence, in the 7 years of deliberate subtraction. And yet, does she know, Callum said, what you're doing here? She knows. And the man's laugh was the worst sound Callum had heard since the war. It came out brief and bitter and completely without humor. She didn't say a word about it. That's how she is. Has been for years, just accepts whatever's coming. Callum looked at Wren Voss across the dusty main street of Harwick, Wyoming, and as if the weight of his attention had physical properties, she looked up from the apple. Their eyes met across the distance, and what he saw in her face was not what he had expected. He had expected fear or calculation or the desperate mute pleading of someone who knows they are being discussed and wants to influence the outcome. He had expected something that asked something of him. There was nothing like that. What he saw was a kind of vast, settled resignation. Not fresh grief, not acute despair, something more worn than either of those, something that had been present long enough to become simply the texture of her existence. The look of someone who has made a certain peace, not because peace was available, but because the alternative, continuing to hope that things might be otherwise, cost more than she had left to spend. He had seen that look before, on men in the field after wounds that were beyond treatment, a particular quieting, a stepping back from the effort of fighting. He did not want to see it on the face of a 20-year-old woman sitting on a bench with an apple in her hands on a Tuesday morning in October. Callum reached into his coat and withdrew the leather pouch he kept there. He counted out $50 in silver coins without speaking, because there was nothing to say that would make this transaction anything other than what it was, and dropped them into the man's shaking hands. "She comes with me now," he said. "Everything she owns, she takes. You don't follow us. You don't come asking for more money or more anything. You don't speak to her or about her to any person living for any reason ever again. If I see you within sight of my property, I will not issue a warning first. We understand each other." The man was already looking at the coins. His fingers had closed around them with the grip of a drowning man who has found something that floats. "We understand each other," he said. "We're clear. Get out of my sight." And Silas Voss, that was his name, Callum would learn it later, turned and walked with the unsteady purposefulness of a man who has done what he came to do and needs to be somewhere that isn't here before he has to look at it anymore. He went across the street and through the doors of the saloon and did not look back at the daughter he was leaving behind on the bench outside the telegraph office. Callum stood on the street for a moment. He had bought a human being. The fact of it sat in him like a swallowed stone, wrong in every direction he turned it. The transaction had been necessary. He believed that. He would believe it in the morning, and he would believe it in a year, and the believing would not make the stone lighter. He walked across the street. Ren Voss did not look up as he approached. The knife continued its slow work on the apple, the peel continuing its spiral as if what had happened across the street and what was now walking toward her were simply weather phenomena that arrived and had to be endured and were not usefully engaged with in advance. Up close, she was both more and less than she had appeared at a distance. The thinness was more pronounced, the kind that accumulates in layers over years rather than arriving all at once. The mending on the dress was more extensive than he had realized, patches on patches in some places. There was a scar through her left eyebrow, pale and old, the kind that comes from impact with something with an edge rather than from ordinary accident. Her wrists, where her sleeves had ridden up slightly, showed the yellowed edges of bruises that were weeks old, and she had pulled her sleeves down to cover them, but the sleeves were not quite long enough. "Your father has made an arrangement," Callum said. He saw no reason to soften it or approach it sideways. She already knew. Direct was the only thing he had to offer. "He sold you to me. I paid him $50. Ren's hand stopped. The knife rested against the half-peeled apple, which she held without moving. She did not look up immediately. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was long enough for Callum to understand that she was not surprised, was not processing new information, was simply deciding something about how to proceed. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely level. The voice of someone who has trained the expressiveness out of it, because expressiveness had historically made things worse rather than better. She set the apple and the knife down on the bench beside her. "Are we going now? Do you have belongings somewhere?" "A few things. Go and get 'em." She stood slowly, the way someone stands when they are testing whether the ground is actually solid, testing whether this moment is actually happening, or whether it belongs to the category of things that seem real but dissolve on contact. When Callum didn't speak or move, she reached behind the bench and retrieved a canvas bag that had been tucked between the bench and the wall. It was small, the kind of bag a child might carry to school. She held it in both hands and straightened up and looked at him with those quiet, assessing eyes. "That's everything," she said. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. He kept whatever he was feeling off his face because his face was not useful here. "That's all of it. That's all of it." He gestured toward the post outside Garfield's, where Soot waited with the long-suffering patience of a horse who has learned that his owner's errands are often longer than advertised. "You'll ride. I'll walk. I'm able to walk. It's 3 hours to the cabin. You'll ride. Something moved across her face. Brief enough that he almost didn't catch it. Not gratitude exactly. More like a person encountering a sentence they don't immediately know how to parse, searching for the trick concealed in the grammar, the cost hidden in the offer. She didn't argue. He helped her up into the saddle. She settled into it with the ease of someone who had ridden before, not recently, but enough that the body remembered. Her back straightened naturally. Her hands found the saddle horn and then released it when she realized she didn't need it. They left Harwick. 3 people watched them go from different vantages on the main street. The shopkeeper at Garfield's, a decent man named Aldrich, who would remember this particular Tuesday for the rest of his life, and would eventually tell the story to anyone who asked why he kept a jar of hard candy on the counter, specifically for children who came in looking like they needed something sweet and hadn't had any lately. A woman in a blue bonnet outside the milliner's who pretended to examine a bolt of fabric in the window while keeping the street reflected in the glass. And a broad man named Burris who had been leaning against the post office wall for the better part of an hour with the air of a man who has nowhere to be and the reality of a man who has been sent somewhere specific to observe and report. Burris watched Callum Mercer walk up the North Road, leading a horse with a girl on it, and then he pushed off the wall and went to find Fletcher Gant. The mountain trail wound upward through pine forest and over a series of rocky switchbacks and across 2 creek crossings before arriving at the elevation where Callum's cabin sat. In good conditions with a horse, it was 2.5 hours. Today they made it in 3 because Callum walked, and the pace was his rather than Soot's. They traveled in silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who don't know each other and have not yet determined what kind of knowing might be possible or appropriate. About halfway up where the trail crossed the larger of the 2 creeks, Callum stopped to let Soot drink. "You should drink too," he said. He did not look at her when he said it. Wren dismounted in one clean motion and knelt at the creek's edge and drank from her cupped hands with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to taking what's available when it's available. She wiped her hands on her dress and stood. She watched the water for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want from me?" Callum was filling his canteen and he kept his attention on that task. He had been expecting the question. The manner of it had not been what he expected. Most people he imagined would have worked toward it slowly, would have approached it with softening language and sideways framing. She had simply asked it in the same flat, direct tone she had used to say, "I know," and that's all of it, as if they were discussing something practical and impersonal. "What are you thinking I might want?" he said. "Men don't pay $50 for nothing." He capped the canteen and looked at her directly because looking away when you're telling someone a hard truth is a form of dishonesty. "I didn't pay for you," he said. "I paid to keep Fletcher Gant from getting to you. Your father was going to take whoever's money arrived first, and Gant is a man who hurts women because he can and has never been stopped from it. I couldn't walk away from that once I knew what it was." She studied him with those steady gray eyes. She was not a person who showed her thinking on her face while she was still doing the thinking. She was good at being still in a way that most people weren't good at, waiting without fidgeting or filling silence with sound. And Callum recognized it because he had developed the same quality in himself through years of solitude, and recognized it in her as something that came from a different source entirely. "So what comes next?" she said. "You come to my cabin. There's a room in the back. It's yours. I'll teach you to shoot if you want to learn. We'll share the work of keeping the place, cooking, mending, whatever needs doing. In the spring, if you want to leave, I'll take you to the next town and give you enough money to start somewhere new. If you want to stay, you stay. The choice is yours when that time comes." She was quiet long enough for the creek to say everything. The silence didn't. "You're serious about this?" she said. "I'm serious." "Why?" "Because I was standing there," he said. "That's the whole reason. I was standing right there and I knew what was going to happen if I walked away, and I've done enough things in my life that I'm not proud of." I didn't need to add that one. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who has run the available information through an internal process and arrived at a provisional conclusion. "All right," she said. "I'll try it. But if you're lying to me, I'll know. I've had a lot of practice at figuring that out. There was something in the way she said it. Not exactly a threat because a threat implies leverage, and she was not operating from a position of leverage. Something more fundamental. A small, carefully maintained ember of self-preservation that whatever had happened to her in 20 years of Silas Voss's household had not managed to extinguish. The part of her that was still watching, still assessing, still refusing to simply accept whatever arrived. Fair enough, Callum said. Let's keep moving. We've got another hour before the light goes. They continued up the mountain. The cabin appeared through the trees as the sun dropped behind the western ridge and painted the sky in the amber and rose of a cold-weather sunset. It was a single-story structure of rough-cut pine logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch along the front and a lean-to shelter attached to the eastern wall where Callum kept soot in his tools and his tack. The logs had been chinked and re-chinked over 7 years against the Wyoming wind, and the result was solid if not beautiful. A man who owns very little has very little to lose, which had been the point when Callum built it. Wren slid down from the saddle and stood in the clearing and looked at it without speaking. It's not much, Callum said. I didn't expect much, she said. The words were not said with bitterness or resignation. They were simply accurate. They worked together in the lean-to unsaddling soot and rubbing him down. Wren moved carefully around the horse, reading his moods with the small adjustments of her approach that indicated genuine experience with animals rather than familiarity with this particular one. He's particular about strangers, Callum said. Take some time. Wren reached out and laid 2 fingers against Soot's nose, a light contact that she held steady until the horse turned into it with the expression of an animal that has decided to grant a provisional acceptance. He already has, she said. Inside, Callum showed her the main room with its stone fireplace and the rough table he had built from salvaged lumber and the 2 chairs that had been his only concession to the possibility of company. He showed her the ladder that led to the sleeping loft above where his own bedding was. And he showed her the back room, small and low-ceilinged, with a bed frame he had built in the 2nd year, and a straw mattress that was less than a year old, and 2 wool blankets folded at the foot. That one is yours, he said. The door latches from the inside. I won't come in unless you ask me to. She stepped into the room. She stood for a moment in the middle of the small space, and then she put her hand on the bed frame. Not testing it, just touching it. The way you touch something when you need to verify through contact that it's real and not a thing your mind has invented has. This is mine, she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It existed in the space between those 2 things. It's yours, Callum said. She turned and looked at him standing in the doorway. Where will you sleep? In the loft. Been sleeping there 7 years. No reason to change that. She nodded. She looked around the small room again, and Callum saw on her face something that he recognized precisely and without effort, because he had felt the same thing in himself in the first weeks on this mountain. The particular bewilderment of a person who has been given something decent and cannot locate the mechanism by which it will be taken away. Are you hungry, he said. The question startled her. Her eyes came back to him quickly with the reflex of someone accustomed to questions, meaning something is about to be required of them. I can make something, she said. I should sit down, he said. I'll make something. Come out when you're ready. He left her there and built the fire in the hearth and set salt pork and dried beans to warming in the pot and made coffee with the last of what he had, which would need replenishing on the next trip down. By the time she appeared in the doorway of her room, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and food, and the coffee was ready. She stood in the doorway as if she was not certain that crossing the threshold without specific invitation was permitted. Sit, Callum said. He gestured toward one of the chairs at the table. She sat. He filled 2 bowls and cut bread from the half loaf he had bought that morning in Harwick, which felt like something that had happened in a different lifetime rather than earlier the same day, and set everything on the table. 2 tin cups of coffee. He sat across from her. Wren looked at the food. She was quiet for a moment. Something wrong, Callum said. No. She paused. She didn't finish the sentence. She picked up her spoon. She ate carefully at first, small bites, with the particular dignity of someone maintaining a standard that is costing them significant effort. Then the hunger that had clearly been present and being suppressed, simply won, and the bites became larger, and she ate steadily and thoroughly until the bowl was empty and the bread was gone, and she kept her eyes on the table the whole time. When she finished, she set the spoon down with care. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." Silence settled in. The fire spoke for both of them. Outside, the wind was picking up through the pines, the first real suggestion of the Wyoming winter beginning to announce itself. "Can I ask you something?" Wren said. "Go ahead. What did you do before you came up here?" Callum looked at the fire. "Soldier," he said. "Fought at Gettysburg and a few other places I don't name if I can avoid it. Trapped for a few years after. Then I came here. Why here to be left alone?" She considered this. Did it work? Sometimes. She looked at her coffee cup. "I used to think about disappearing," she said. "When I was younger, just walking into the hills somewhere and not coming back. Living where nobody could track me down." "Why didn't you?" "I didn't know how to feed myself out there," she said. "And I figured I'd just die slower that way instead of all at once." The matter-of-factness of it was worse than if she'd said it with bitterness. It was just a calculation she had made, one of many measured and stored and moved on from. "You're not going to die here," Callum said. "You can't know that. I can promise it won't be by my hand or my negligence." She looked at him then. The full directness of those gray eyes scanning his face with the practiced attention of someone who has spent years reading people for the truth that exists beneath what they say. Whatever she found or didn't find made something shift in her expression. Something behind her eyes went briefly liquid. She blinked twice. A single tear moved down her cheek and she caught it with the back of her hand and pressed her knuckles hard against her mouth. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't apologize. I don't know why I'm—" "You don't have to explain yourself. Not here. Not to me." The tears came quietly after that, almost without sound, which was the thing that struck him hardest. She had learned to cry without taking up space with it, had practiced that specific economy until it was second nature. The tears moved down her face, and she did not wipe them away and did not make any sound beyond what was unavoidable, and she looked at the fire rather than at him. Callum stood and found a cloth on the shelf and set it on the table beside her without commentary. Then he turned to the fire and made a thorough project of banking the coals for the night, giving her the privacy of his back until the sounds from the table told him the moment had passed. When he turned around again, she had composed herself. Her eyes were reddened at the edges, but her face had returned to its careful arrangement. She stood. "I should sleep," she said. "It's been a long day." "Good idea. If you need anything in the night, I'm right above you." She moved to the doorway of her room. She paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. "Callum, yeah, thank you for not being Fletcher Gant." She went in. The door closed. He heard the latch click into place, and then because she was who she was and had learned what she had learned, the careful sounds of furniture being moved. Callum stood in the firelight for a while. He had bought a human being today. He had done it with his eyes open and for reasons he believed in, and he would do it again, given the same circumstances, and none of that made the stone in his chest lighter. Necessary and right were related but not identical, and he had stopped confusing them around the third year of the war. He climbed the ladder to the loft and lay on his bedroll and listened to the wind in the pines and the faint sounds of a young woman making a door more secure in the room below him. Sleep took a long time. 3 days of unbroken snow transformed the world above Harwick into something Wren had no word for. Not silence, because silence implied the absence of sound, and there was no absence here. More like a change in the quality of everything, the erasure of the arbitrary and incidental, leaving only what was structural. Trees, rock, the cabin, the lean-to, the creek reduced to a sound beneath the white. She stood at the window on the fourth morning and watched it and felt something that she was careful not to name, because naming things made them real in a way that made losing them more specific. Callum woke to find the fire already built and coffee already made, and Wren at the table with her canvas bag open, removing its contents one at a time and laying them out on the table with the careful attention of someone conducting an inventory. 2 changes of clothing, both mended well past the point where mending was cosmetic. A small, bone-handled knife in a leather sheath. A piece of ribbon that had once been the particular blue of a clear afternoon sky and was now something more faded and complicated. A folded piece of paper that she touched once and set aside with a deliberateness that communicated clearly that it was not for outside eyes. And a book. The book was small and old. Its cover had been worn to bare board at the corners. Its spine had cracked and been re-cracked until it held together more through habit than through structural integrity. She set it on the table and smoothed the cover with 2 fingers in a gesture so automatic it was clearly not something she was aware of, doing the gesture of a person whose hands know where something precious is before the rest of them does. Callum came down the ladder and poured coffee and sat across from her. He looked at the book without commenting on it. She looked at him looking at it and said nothing. They drank their coffee in the manner of people who are beginning to understand each other's silences, which is different from understanding each other. Winter arrived with the uncompromising seriousness that Wyoming winters reserve for themselves. The temperature dropped until the creek at the bottom of the trail froze hard enough to walk on. Snow came and went, and came again with the regularity of something that had a schedule to keep. The days shortened until darkness was arriving in mid-afternoon with the comfortable certainty of a tenant who has paid in advance. Callum had lived alone for 7 years. He had built his routines around solitude, the way you build infrastructure around a load-bearing fact, everything oriented toward it, dependent on it, organized by it. He had expected Ren's presence to feel like disruption, like something placed against the grain of the established order. It didn't. It felt like a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of absence, which was what he'd had, but the quiet of 2 people who have independently arrived at the conclusion that unnecessary words are a form of waste. She was up before him every morning and had the fire going and water heating before he came down the ladder. She cooked without being asked, working within the limits of the larder with the practiced competence of someone who has spent years making enough out of not quite enough. She cleaned and organized and mended, but she also, with increasing confidence as the days accumulated, simply occupied the space. She sat in the second chair by the fire in the evenings and read or looked at the flames and did not feel the need to account for herself or justify her stillness. He found he appreciated that more than he could have anticipated. On a Tuesday in November, it was always Tuesdays that changed things. He was beginning to notice he took her outside to teach her to shoot. He had been thinking about it since the first week. Not because he expected specific trouble, though. The specific trouble was out there, and he was not a man who ignored the landscape. More because he had spent enough years in situations where being unprepared was indistinguishable from being unarmed to understand that preparation and expectation of danger were different things. He set up tin cans on the fence rail at the clearing's edge and handed her the rifle. She took it with the grip and stance of someone who has observed the correct way to hold a firearm and retained the information precisely, which was not the same as having been taught. "I've held one before," she said without being asked. "My father had a rifle. He never let me shoot it. But I watched how he held it, and I remembered." She raised the stock to her shoulder and aimed at the first can. Then the shot went 2 feet wide, because at the last instant, her body contracted a sharp, involuntary flinch that originated somewhere below the level of conscious decision and expressed itself in the hands and shoulders and ruined the aim entirely. She lowered the rifle. Her jaw was set. "Try again," Callum said. She raised it. The same thing happened. The shot went into the snow. She lowered the rifle and looked at the undisturbed row of tin cans with an expression that was not about the tin cans at all. "It's not the gun," Callum said. "I know that. Your body is bracing for pain when the shot fires." She didn't respond. She was looking at the fence rail. "It's not a failing," he said. "It's what bodies learn when they've been given sufficient reason to expect pain. There's nothing wrong with the reflex. We just need to teach it a different association." She looked at him. "How?" "Breath. Before you fire, take a long breath in. Release half of it. Then fire on the exhale while your body is in the process of releasing rather than bracing. Give it something to do that isn't contracting." She tried it, breathed in, released slowly. The third shot clipped the second can. Not a clean hit. Enough to matter. The fourth shot knocked a can cleanly off the rail. Ren lowered the rifle and looked at the empty space on the fence where the can had been, and then she looked at the can lying in the snow, and something moved across her face before she could prevent it. Something unguarded and quick. "Keep going," Callum said before the moment could close. She shot until her fingers were too cold for fine motor control and her shoulder ached from the recoil. She hit approximately 1 in 4 by the end, which was better than most people managed on the first day, and she knew it wasn't good enough yet, and she was out behind the cabin again the following morning without being told. He taught her to track, to read what the snow recorded, the difference between a deer that was browsing and a deer that was moving with purpose, the weight of an animal in the depth of its print, the age of a track in the quality of its edge. She absorbed it with the focused retention of someone who has learned that knowledge is a form of safety, and safety is not something you have excess of. He taught her to check and reset the trap lines. She learned to skin a rabbit cleanly by the end of the second week. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. He worked on tack or sharpened blades or carved. She read. One night he came in from securing the lean-to against a coming storm and found her at the table with the small book open, her lips moving slightly as she worked through a passage. The candlelight caught the marginalia in the inside cover handwriting, different from the print of the text, smaller and more personal. What is it? He said. She looked up. Poems, she said. My mother's. She left it to me when she died. Tell me about her. Wren looked at the page for a moment. Then she began haltingly at first in the manner of someone who has not spoken about something precious in a long time and is not certain the words will come out whole. Her mother had been a woman named Grace, who had come west from Ohio as a young woman with a husband who was at the time of their marriage still capable of being the man he had intended to be. They had built something small and workable on a piece of land outside Harwick. Grace had grown a garden and raised a daughter and read by candlelight every evening and taught that daughter to read the same way in secret, because by the time Wren was 8 years old, Silas had decided that reading made women difficult, and difficult was something he didn't have patience for. Grace Voss had died in February of 1865 of pneumonia, the kind that a doctor might have treated if Silas had been willing to spend money on a doctor rather than on whiskey. She had been 39 years old. Wren had been 12. I never got to tell her, Wren said, and then stopped. Tell her what? She shook her head once. Just things you think you'll have time to say. Callum set down the leather strap he had been working on. She knew, he said. You can't know that. She taught you to read in secret, he said. She kept that up for years, knowing the risk of it. A woman who does that for her daughter knows what she needs to know about how her daughter feels about her. Wren looked at the book. Her jaw tightened and released. She would have liked you, she said. My mother. She had a way of seeing people accurately. She would have seen what you are. I'm not sure I'm worth seeing particularly clearly. I know what people look like who aren't worth much, Wren said. I was raised by one. You don't look like that. They sat in a different kind of silence after that. Something had been placed in it that changed its character. Then she looked at him across the fire. Can I ask you something personal? Depends on what it is. Why did you really leave? After the war. He was quiet long enough that the fire had time to settle and resettle. I killed a lot of people, he said. Some of them had it coming, and some of them were boys who were handed a rifle and pointed at a field and told to walk into it, and after a while I couldn't reliably tell the difference between those two groups anymore. And I decided I needed to stop before I stopped caring about the difference. He looked at the fire. So I left. Do you still see them? Sometimes. What do you do when you do? Get up. Do the next thing. He paused. It took me years to understand that was all there was available to do. Get up. Do the next thing. Wren turned this over. I dream I'm back in his house, she said. That all of this is something I imagined. That I wake up and I'm still there. You're not there. I know that. But the dream doesn't know that. It gets better, Callum said. Not gone. Better. How long did that take you? He considered lying. He thought about it for maybe a second. Years, he said. She nodded as if this was exactly the answer she had calculated on and had already decided to accept. The following week, Wren came down from the loft where she had gone to retrieve a blanket Callum had told her to use, and she came down carrying the blanket and something else. She set the something else on the table in front of him. It was a book, one of 4 he kept in the trunk under his bedroll. A collection of American poetry, thick and worn, its pages soft from years of handling. I have 3 others, he said. She looked at the book and then at him. I didn't know if you'd want them, he said. Didn't know if it would feel like too much. She picked up the book and opened it to a middle page and read a few lines silently. Then she looked up. "Can I borrow it? You can have it." Something crossed her face that she didn't manage to contain before it was visible. She looked down quickly. "Thank you," she said carefully. "There are 2 more if you want those too," he said. "And if you want to read aloud sometime, I don't object to hearing it." She read to him that evening. The fire between them, her voice quiet and steady, a poem about winter light over a harbor. When she finished, neither of them spoke. The silence that follows good reading is its own distinct thing, different from all other silences. And both of them seemed to know that talking into it would be wasteful. One afternoon in early December, the chimney started making sounds that Callum did not like. A low groan when the wind changed direction. A vibration through the stone that he could feel in the floor. "Ice buildup," he told her. "I need to get up there." The roof was steep and the December freeze had glazed the surface into something closer to polished iron than wood and shingle. He got up there with the ladder and found the blockage and worked at it with the long iron rod he kept for exactly this contingency, and he was beginning to think the worst of it was cleared when his left boot found a patch of ice that was more glass than friction. Both feet went out from under him at once. He had time to register the angle and the speed and the edge of the roof approaching, and he reached for the gutter with both hands and caught it, and his weight swung, and the old wood held for slightly more than a second, and then gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and he came through the porch overhang in a shower of old lumber and frozen shingles, and landed on the steps below with considerable force and very little dignity. He lay on his back looking at the December sky through the hole he had made in the overhang. Then he heard her coming around the corner of the cabin. Fast. She stopped at the edge of the wreckage and looked at him lying amid the debris and looked at the hole in the overhang and looked back at him, and then she started laughing. Not polite laughter or the nervous laughter that sometimes covered alarm. The deep, uncontrolled laughter of someone who has been completely ambushed by something absurd, the kind that takes over breathing and doesn't release when you want it to. She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were streaming. "I could be dying," Callum said from the wreckage. She tried to form words and couldn't. "I went through the roof," he said. "The way you just..." She couldn't finish. "The way you..." More laughter. Despite the fact that something in his lower back was presenting a very specific and emphatic complaint, Callum found the corner of his mouth going up against his will. "Glad this is useful to you. I'm sorry." She was not sorry at all, or not sorry enough for it to affect the laughter. It's just the expression on your face when you went through the help me up. She extended both hands, still shaking, and he took them, and she pulled with more strength than he'd expected, and he came to his feet and stood in the ruins of the overhang, testing each joint and finding them all present, if not entirely comfortable. They looked at the damage together. "I guess we're rebuilding that," Callum said. "I guess we are," Wren said. She was smiling, a real smile, unguarded and complete, and it changed her face so thoroughly that she looked like a different person, or rather, she looked like the person who had been there all along beneath the careful arrangement. It was the first time he had seen her look her age. They spent 3 days rebuilding the overhang in the thin winter sunlight. Wren turned out to know things about framing that surprised him. "You've built things before," he said, watching her fit a board into place with precise, certain hands. "My mother and I repaired the barn roof once," she said. "When I was about 14. My father said it didn't need doing yet. We knew better. We figured out how it was supposed to go by taking apart the parts that had already failed and working backward." She ran her hand along the new framing, checking the alignment by touch. "Things have a logic to them. Once you see the logic, you can usually reconstruct the original intention. That's a useful way to think about most things." She glanced at him. "I've had a lot of practice working backward from things." When the overhang was finished, it was squarer and better braced than the original, and Wren stood back from it with her arms crossed, and an expression that Callum recognized because he had seen the same expression on good craftsmen after good work, and it looked exactly the same on her as it did on them. The first week of December brought a woman to the foot of the mountain trail. Callum found her when he went down to check the lower trap lines. She was sitting on a rock at the trailhead with a canvas bag in her lap, and her right arm held against her body in the careful, economical way that indicated either a break or something close to it. Her face had the layered colors of bruising at different stages. the yellowish green of injuries from a week ago, and the darker purple of injuries from days ago, which told a story about frequency rather than singularity. Her name was Nora Holt, 38 years old, 12 years of marriage to a man who had gotten progressively worse in every direction over that time. And 3 days ago, she had told him she was leaving, and he had broken her arm to express his position on the matter, and she had waited until he passed out from drinking and walked until she couldn't walk anymore and sat down. "How did you find this trail?" Callum asked. "A woman in town," Nora said there was a man on this mountain who had helped a girl who had nowhere to go. Said he might do the same for someone else. "Who told you that?" She wouldn't say. Said I'd know who she was if I saw her. Callum thought about Aldrich at Garfield's, about the way the man had watched them leave, about the candy jar. "Can you walk if we go slowly?" "I think so." He carried her bag and they went slowly and made the cabin in just over 2 hours. When Callum opened the door, Wren was at the table with her book. She looked at Nora Holt once, all of it, the arm and the bruises and the canvas bag, and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from managing a dangerous situation for too long. And she stood and said, "Come in and sit by the fire," and didn't ask Callum anything at all. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Wren guide Nora to the better chair and retrieve the small medicine kit from the shelf, and begin very gently and with precise questions assessing the arm. He felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have immediate language for. He put water on to heat and stayed out of the way. Nora's arm was broken, a clean fracture that would heal properly if it was immobilized correctly. Wren had seen a broken arm set before, she said simply without details, and her hands were steady and sure, and Nora cried once briefly, and Wren didn't try to talk her out of it. That night, Callum gave Nora the room and climbed to the loft, and Wren climbed to the loft too, in the spare bedroll that hadn't been used in 7 years, and they lay in the dark with the sounds of the mountain around them and the warmth of the fire working its way up from below. He was aware of her being awake. "What will happen to her?" Wren said. "Her sister lives in Beaumont, 2 days east. I'll take her there when she can travel. What if her husband comes looking? Then he deals with me." Silence. "That's not sufficient," Wren said. "No," Callum agreed. "It isn't, but it's what we have right now." She was quiet again, and then, "There are others like her in Harwick. I've seen them. Women with faces that say one thing and mean another. I knew how to read those faces even before I understood why I knew. I know. We should do something that's more than one case at a time." Callum looked at the dark ceiling above him. "We're already doing something," he said. "We're doing the minimum." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "We are." He could feel her thinking in the dark beside him. The particular quality of silence that exists when a person is not resting but processing, working something through toward a conclusion. He could feel the conclusion arriving, settling into her, becoming fixed. He took Nora to Beaumont on a clear, cold morning in mid-December, when the cold was sharp enough to make breathing feel productive. He rode there and back in 2 days and came home with saddlebags full of supplies and a book he had found at the Mercantile in Beaumont, a collection of American stories that the proprietor had pressed on him with the enthusiasm of someone who reads for pleasure and doesn't understand why everyone doesn't. When he got back, Wren had moved the table. Not dramatically, shifted slightly toward the window where the light came in better in the mornings. The 2 chairs angled differently toward the fire. A small arrangement of dried winter berries in a tin cup on the shelf that he kept tools on. Small adjustments that changed the feeling of the room in ways he couldn't have specified but could easily feel. She was at the stove making something that smelled considerably more complex than anything he had produced from the same larder. He set the book on the table. She looked at it while she stirred. Then she looked at him. He offered nothing beyond a slight movement of his shoulders. She picked it up and examined the cover, and her face did something complicated that resolved into something settled. "Thank you," she said quietly. He hung up his coat. "What are you making?" She told him. He sat down at the table that was now in the right place. That night she laughed for the first time. A real laugh, unplanned, arriving before she could do anything about it. He had been telling a story about a mule in Virginia during the war that had developed a personal and specifically targeted hostility toward his commanding officer, a man who in Callum's private assessment had earned it. The laugh came out and she caught it immediately, pressing her lips together, eyes going wide in what looked almost like alarm at herself. "Don't do that," Callum said. "What?" "Swallow it back down. You're allowed to laugh in your own home." She looked at him. The word home landed somewhere in her face. "This is your home," he said. "I want to be clear about that." She opened her mouth and then closed it. Then, "Okay," she said quietly. He finished the story about the mule. She laughed again, and this time she didn't stop it. It came out clean and full and without apology, and it filled the cabin the way warmth fills a cold room from the edges inward until there's nowhere cold left. The second week of January brought a rare warm afternoon cold, still but bright, and Callum took Wren down to the creek below the cabin where it ran open under a rock shelf and showed her how to fish. She was remarkably terrible at it. Her first cast landed in a bush 3 feet to her left. Her second nearly took his hat off. Her third sent the hook into a branch 15 feet above the water in a manner that could only be explained by geometry that Callum didn't fully understand and couldn't have reproduced intentionally. "This is not something I'm suited to," Wren said. "You've had 3 attempts. 3 attempts and a hat attack. That seems like sufficient data." He untangled her line from the branch with the patience of a man who has spent years alone and learned that being bothered by things that don't need bothering about is a waste of finite resource. "Try again. Stop thinking about the line. Think about where you want it to land." She tried again. The cast went where she'd intended. "Better," he said. "Better is not good. Better is the beginning of good." She shot him a look that was dry and precise and completely unexpected, and it startled a laugh out of him before he could stop it. He had not been surprised into laughter in a long time. The unexpectedness of it was pleasant in a way that he recognized from before the war and had not been sure he still had access to. They stood at the creek for 2 hours. She managed 4 casts out of 12 that went where she aimed, which was real progress, and on the 7th cast, she felt the line pull taut. "Something's on it," she said, and her voice changed entirely. "Pull back slow. Don't jerk it." She pulled back. The line ran sideways and she corrected for it without being told, shifting her weight and adjusting her grip with the instinctive response of someone whose body had already done the calculation. The fish fought and she held at arms, working, concentrating with her entire self. "Bring it in now," Callum said. "Easy. That's it." The fish broke the surface. A good-sized trout, silver in the January light, and the creek splashing around it. She pulled it to the bank, stood looking at it lying there, and then she made a sound that was not quite a word and turned and put both arms around Callum with her face against his coat and held on. He went very still. Then he put his hands on her shoulders gently and held on back. She stepped away almost immediately, her face gone red under the cold, not from the temperature. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't think before I was just—" "That was you catching a fish," Callum said. That seemed worth marking. She looked at the trout, then at him. Then she laughed, and this laugh was the fullest one yet, coming up from somewhere undefended and going out into the cold air above the frozen creek and up into the pines. And Callum thought it was very likely the best sound he had heard since he came to this mountain 7 years ago. February settled in with the quiet seriousness of the deepest part of the season. Now it was Wren who found the books. She had gone up to the loft to retrieve an extra blanket and came down with the blanket and one of the volumes from the trunk under his bedroll. She set it on the table in front of him without accusation and without question, but with the quality of someone who expects to be told something. "I have 3 others," he said. She looked at the book and then at him. "I didn't know if you'd want to see them," he said. "Didn't know if it would be too much," she said. "Yeah." She opened it. She read for a moment. She turned several pages and read another passage. Then she looked up. "Can I have this one too? You can have all 3. She looked back down at the page. After a moment she said, without looking up, "One of the books I read had notes in it. Your handwriting." He nodded. "You wrote about the war," she said. "Just small things, thoughts, names." She paused. "You wrote about someone named Prescott, 17 years old, in your unit." Callum said nothing. "You wrote that you still think about him." Silence. "You came up here because of Prescott," she said, "and the others like him, because carrying them got too heavy to do in the company of other people." He considered the fire for a while. Yeah, he said. She looked at her hands. I think you've been punishing yourself, she said. I think you came up here because you decided you didn't deserve anything better than four walls and a list of names that won't let you put them down. Callum was quiet for a long time. The fire burned between them, and the mountain was silent outside, and the wind had died down to nothing. Maybe he said, "You do deserve better," she said. She said it the way she said factual things, without emphasis or performance, because she had decided it was true and stated true things plainly. You deserve more than this. He looked at her. She held his gaze with the steadiness that had been growing in her over these months, something that had been there all along beneath the surface and was finding its way back out. It was different from the resignation he had seen across the street in October. It was the same stillness, but with something behind it now. A person standing in it rather than retreating into it. You too, he said. I know, she said. I'm starting to actually believe it. She paused. That's new. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain breathed in and out in the way mountains do, which is very slowly and without caring what's inside or outside their slopes. And then, at the exact moment when it had become possible to believe that the silence was all there was, that Harwick was very far below, and Fletcher Gant was a man who had reconsidered a sound, came from the edge of the clearing. A single footstep in the snow, then the quiet, uncertain knock of knuckles on the cabin door. Wren's head came up sharply. Callum was already on his feet, his hand going to the rifle on the wall before the second knock came. Then a voice came through the door, rough with cold and something else, something more complicated than cold. Wren, it's your father. I know I don't have any right to be here, but there's something Fletcher Gant is planning, and you need to know what it is. Wren stood perfectly still across the room from Callum, her hand on the back of her chair, her face entirely illegible. Callum looked at her and waited. He would not make this decision for her. The knock came again softer, as if whatever conviction was holding it up was losing ground. Wren did not move. She stood with her hand on the chair and her eyes on the door, and her face held the specific stillness of someone who has spent years learning to make non-decision appear the same as decision. The fire burned. The wind outside had picked up enough to move through the pines. Then she said, "Open it." Callum lifted the latch. Silas Voss stood on the rebuilt porch in the February dark, looking like a man who has been traveling in weather that was not indifferent to his existence. He was thinner than he had been in October, his coat inadequate for the temperature, his face carrying the gray undertone of a body that has been presenting unpaid bills for years and is beginning to collect. His right eye was swollen nearly shut, and there was a cut along his jaw that had not been cleaned properly and was healing badly as a result. His hat was in his hands. He looked at Callum first, then passed him at Wren. He said nothing immediately. He stood there with the cold coming off him in waves, holding his hat, and looked at his daughter across the threshold, and whatever he was feeling showed in his face in a way that Callum suspected he could not have prevented. You look like hell, Callum said. Silas's mouth moved. Gant's men found me 2 days ago, he said. Said I owed him for the time I cost them. He looked down at the hat, said I wasn't of use anymore and needed to understand what that meant. What did you come to tell her? Silas looked at Wren again. She had not moved and her expression had not changed, and she was giving him precisely nothing, which was Callum understood exactly the correct amount. He's going to burn the cabin, Silas said. Gant. He's been planning it out since November. He's going to come up here with enough men that it doesn't matter how good a shot either of you are, set fire to the place and take Wren in the confusion. He paused. And he plans to make sure you don't survive it. He looked at Callum when he said the last part. How do you know this, Callum said. Because he told me, Silas said. He told me because he thought I was still his man. Because he thought what his men did to my face was meant to correct me rather than dismiss me. He looked like a man who has learned painfully and recently the difference between those two things. I am not his man. I don't expect that to mean anything to either of you. But I came up here through cold that I don't have the coat for because it was the only thing I could think of to do that wasn't nothing. Silence. Wren moved then. She crossed to the table and sat down and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. When is he planning to do it, she said. Soon, Silas said. He's waiting for a man from Cheyenne, someone he uses when he wants things done without witnesses. He'll have to manage afterward. When that man arrives, they move. How many men? 6 to 8. Silas hesitated. He wants it to look like a fire on a winter night. Accidental. He's done it before, not here. Somewhere else. Callum studied Silas carefully the way you study terrain when you need to know where the surface lies about what's underneath. Why are you actually here, he said. Not what you've told us. The real reason. Silas was quiet. Because he's going to kill her, he said finally. And she is the last thing I haven't yet destroyed. The words came out flat and without any attempt to make them land a particular way, and that absence of performance was what gave them their weight. Wren was looking at her hands on the table. You can sleep in the lean-to, she said. There are blankets on the top shelf by the tack. She did not look up. Don't come into the cabin without knocking first. Yes, Silas said. All right. He went back out into the cold. Callum closed the door and latched it. The fire burned. Wren stayed at the table with her hands flat on the surface. Callum sat across from her and was quiet because there was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. Finally, she said, he's going to come regardless of what we do. Yes, waiting here gives him every advantage he could want. Yes, she looked up. Then we don't wait. He held her gaze. No, he said. We don't. She nodded and the decision settled between them with the solidity of something that had always been going to happen. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. He told her. They talked until the fire burned low and the plan they built was simple, because simple plans are the ones that survive contact with the unexpected. It rested on 2 things that Callum believed in when he believed in very little else. Going first, and being where the other person doesn't expect you. Now he had to tell her the other part. There's something else, he said. She waited. Before any of this happened, he said, before Gant, before your father outside Garfield's, I want you to know that I understand what the transaction was. What it looked like. What it was. He kept his eyes on her face. I'm not asking you to feel anything about the way things started. I'm asking you to know that wherever you want to go when this is over, I'll take you there. Spring was the original agreement. Spring still stands. Wren was quiet for a long time, long enough that he wondered if he'd misjudged the moment entirely. I know that, she said. I knew that before you said it. She looked at the fire. That's not what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about? She looked at him then fully with those gray eyes that had never learned to dissemble. I'm thinking that I don't want to go anywhere, she said. I'm thinking that this is the place I want to be, and you are the person I want to be here with. She paused. I'm thinking I'm not sure I know how to say that without it sounding like something it isn't. Without it sounding like I'm saying it because I feel I have to. Callum looked at her. It doesn't sound like that, he said. She held his gaze. All right, she said. Then that's what I'm thinking. The fire between them settled into its lower evening state, and outside the mountain held its February cold around the cabin like something deliberate, and they sat with what had been said until it had been present long enough to become part of the room. In the morning, Callum rode down to Harwick. He went to Sheriff Aldous Crane. Crane was 58 and had been sheriffing Harwick County for 11 years and had the face of a man who had seen enough human behavior to have stopped being surprised by most of it while retaining just enough residual surprise to remain useful. He had been watching Fletcher Gant the way you watch a river in a wet spring, knowing the flood is coming, unable to make it come at a different time or in a different direction, trying to have the sandbags in the right places. He listened to Callum without interrupting for 20 minutes. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. You understand what you're asking me to do, Crane said. You're asking me to move against the most powerful man in this county based on the testimony of a man who sold his own daughter for whiskey money. I'm asking you to be at a specific place at a specific time, Callum said. What you witness when you get there is what you act on. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. And if I'm not there, then somebody dies and you spend the next decade explaining to yourself why you stayed in your office. Crane was quiet for a long time, where he said, and when. Callum told him. He rode back up the mountain through the thin February light and found Wren at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing slowly with the careful deliberation of someone for whom the physical act of forming letters is still something that requires conscious attention. He hung up his coat and came to the table. She had written 2 words, Ren Voss. She was looking at them. He sat down across from her. She didn't look up. If something goes wrong, she said, I wanted to have done this at least once. He looked at the 2 words on the paper. Neat, careful, complete. Nothing is going to go wrong, he said. You don't know that. No, he paused. Write something else. She looked at him. Write another name underneath it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the paper. Slowly, letter by letter, she wrote 2 more words below the first 2. Ren Mercer. She set the pencil down. They both looked at what was written. Is that all right, she said. More than all right, he said. She folded the paper once precisely and set it to the side. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Callum cleaned and loaded every weapon in the cabin and verified the ammunition and showed Ren where everything was and how to reach it without having to think about it. They went over the plan twice and then a third time, not because either of them had forgotten it, but because repetition was how you made sure your body had learned what your mind already knew. In the evening, Silas came to the door and knocked, and Callum let him in, and the 3 of them ate together in a silence that was not comfortable but was functional. The silence of people with a shared purpose. At one point, Silas looked at Ren. I know I don't have the right. Then don't, she said. Not tonight. He nodded. They finished the meal. He went back to the lean-to. Callum sat in the chair by the door through the night with his rifle across his knees and watched the dark until it became gray, and the gray became the thin, certain light of a February dawn in Wyoming. When Ren came out, she looked at him and the rifle and said nothing. She made coffee and handed him a cup and sat in the other chair. You didn't sleep, she said. No. She drank her coffee. He drank his. They left the cabin 2 hours after first light, all 3 of them on horseback riding down the mountain through the cold, bright morning. Silas on Callum's spare sorrel, Ren on Soot. Callum on the bay he had borrowed from Garfield's stable the previous day, a detail he had arranged on his way back from Crane's office. The plan was simple. Simple plans were the ones that worked when things moved in directions you hadn't anticipated. They were not going to wait for Gant to come to them. They were going to go to Gant. The Gant Ranch was 4 miles south of Harwick on the best land in the county, which it occupied because Gant had spent 20 years ensuring that it did by methods that did not reward close examination. The main house was large and deliberate in a way that said money rather than comfort every board and shingle an argument for the owner's significance. The outbuilding spread around it with the casual expansion of a man who has never had to consider whether he was taking up more than his portion. When Callum and Ren rode through the main gate at mid-morning with Silas behind them, 6 hands were visible in the yard and all of them stopped what they were doing. Callum rode to 20 yards from the front steps and stopped. Fletcher Gant appeared in the doorway in the unhurried way of a man who has never needed to hurry because the world has historically rearranged itself around his schedule. He was broad through the shoulders with the remains of a face that had probably been worth looking at 20 years ago and had since settled into something harder and more calculated. He looked at Callum, then at Ren, then at Silas. Something moved in his face when he saw Silas, something that he pulled back before it fully formed. Mercer, he said, didn't expect you off that mountain. Didn't expect you to give me sufficient reason, Callum said. Gant came down off the porch and walked out into his yard with the ease of a man on terrain he controls, which he was. Behind Callum, he could hear hands repositioning, not running, just moving to better positions, with the practiced, casual efficiency of men who have done this type of repositioning before. You're trespassing, Gant said, and you brought a drunk and a girl for backup. He looked at Ren with the assessing look of a man who thinks of people as things to be evaluated for utility, and she held his gaze without moving in the saddle. I came to tell you something, Callum said. Go ahead. Whatever you've been planning since October, Callum said. It's done. There is no version of what you're intending that ends in a direction that's good for you. I am telling you clearly and in advance so that you understand this is not a situation that more men or more money is going to change. Gant smiled, a smile that had been deployed often enough to become automatic. Is that a fact? That's a fact. And what exactly gives a retired soldier and a purchased girl the standing to tell me what's done and what isn't. Callum didn't respond immediately. He looked past Gant toward the south fence of the ranch. Sheriff Crane's horse appeared at the fence line. Then Crane himself with 2 deputies. They came through the gate at a measured walk and stopped 20 feet to Gant's left. Gant turned. He looked at Crane, then at Callum, then at Silas. The smile was gone. Aldous Gant said, "You're a long way from your office." "Not especially," Crane said with the calm of a man who has prepared this moment carefully and is now simply executing it. "I've got some questions for you, Fletcher, about a fire near the Dunmore property 3 years ago, and some other matters." He glanced at Silas Voss. "I have a witness prepared to speak to several of them. That man is a drunk and a liar." "Maybe so," Crane said, "but right now he's my witness, which means he's under my protection until I've heard what he has to say." He looked at Gant with 11 years of sheriffing behind his eyes. "I'm going to need you to come with me, Fletcher." One of the hands by the barn took 2 steps forward, and Callum had the rifle up and level before the 3rd step happened. The hand stopped. Wren had her pistol drawn and aimed at the hand near the corral who had been moving his hand toward his belt with the slow casualness of a man hoping not to be noticed. He had been noticed. His hands went visible. "Tell your men to stand down," Callum said to Gant. "Nobody needs to get shot today. The day is still young and we can all still leave it in better condition than we entered it." Gant stood in the middle of his yard with his hands at his sides and took account of his morning. Crane and deputies on his left, Callum and his rifle on his right, Wren with a pistol in front of him, Silas behind him on a horse watching with the expression of a man who knows he has done one right thing in a long time and is in the process of deciding how he feels about it. The hand stood down. Gant looked at Wren. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is," Wren said. Her voice was completely level in the cold morning air. She held the pistol without any tremor. "You came after me because you believed I was something you could own. I am not. I never was. And the person who thought he could make me into that," she did not look at Silas when she said it does not get to decide what happens next. "I do." Gant held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something and not finding the new numbers acceptable. Then Crane moved his horse forward, and the moment ended. Gant went with the deputies without physical resistance, which surprised several of the hands and surprised no one who understood him. Fletcher Gant had maintained his position for 20 years by knowing which confrontations to have and which to defer. He would fight this in lawyers' offices and courtrooms, which was the terrain he understood best. The yard of his own ranch was no longer that terrain. As the deputies rode out with Gant between them, a young hand of perhaps 25 with a decent face walked up to Callum's horse. "I want you to know," the hand said, "that I didn't know about the fire plan. None of us in the bunkhouse knew that was what he was planning." He paused. "I won't be here when you ride back past." Callum looked at him. "What's your name?" "Eli Marsh." "You know horses. Born to it. Nothing else worth knowing as far as I can tell." Callum thought about the lean-to on his mountain and the work that spring would bring. "Come find me in Harwick in a week," he said. "Ask at Garfield's. They'll know where I am." Eli Marsh stepped back and nodded. Callum looked at Wren. She was holstering the pistol with steady hands, watching the road where Gant had gone with the expression of someone closing something that had been open too long. She felt his eyes and looked at him. "You all right?" he said. She considered the question seriously, which was how she considered every question. "Yes," she said. "I think I genuinely am." They rode back toward Harwick together, all 3 of them, and at the edge of town, Silas peeled off without being told, heading for the livery, heading away. He did not look back. Wren watched him go. "He did one right thing," Callum said. "I know," she said. "Does it change anything for you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not everything has to change something," she said. "Some things can just be what they are." He nodded. They rode into town. The trial of Fletcher Gant came in March when the snow was still present on the ground, but the light had begun returning to the afternoons with the tentative optimism of something that has been gone a long time and isn't entirely sure of its welcome. The territorial judge came up from Cheyenne. The courtroom, which was also the town hall, and on 3 recorded occasions the site of town dances, was full. Callum testified with the precision and economy of a man who knows the difference between information and noise, and provides only the former. Wren testified. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and answered every question in the same clear-level voice she had used in Gant's yard. And when Gant's lawyer attempted to characterize her as property transferred through a legal transaction and therefore not eligible to speak to her own welfare, she looked at the lawyer with her gray eyes and said quietly, and with the certainty of someone who settled this question for herself a long time ago, "I am a person. I have always been a person. Paperwork doesn't change that." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Then they called Silas Voss. He came in from the side door, looking like a man walking towards something he has no confidence he deserves to reach. He was cleaner than he had been at the cabin door. The eye had healed. He sat in the witness chair and folded his hands on his knees and looked at the judge rather than the room. He testified for nearly an hour. He described the fire plan. He described the man from Cheyenne and what that man had done in other places. He described other things he had witnessed in years of proximity to Fletcher Gant, things that had been whispered about in Harwick for a long time and never placed into any official record. Gant's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. When Silas finished, the lawyer attempted to destroy his credibility with the facts of his life, which were not difficult to find. The judge heard the lawyer out and then said that credibility was a more complicated matter than the lawyer seemed to believe, and that he would weigh the testimony as he saw appropriate, and his tone suggested that this line of argument was unlikely to produce further returns. Gant's lawyer made his case. It was a capable case built on the framework of a man accustomed to money-solving problems. But the framework had structural weaknesses, and Crane's testimony addressed several of them, and what Silas had provided addressed several more. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. 15 years. Gant received the verdict with the stillness of a man who was already thinking about appeals. He did not look at Wren when they let him out. She watched him go. Outside the courthouse in the March light, Crane shook Callum's hand and nodded at Wren. "You did good," he said. "Both of you. This county is meaningfully better today than it was yesterday." "Thank you for being there," Wren said. "I wasn't doing you a favor," Crane said. "I was doing the job I'm supposed to do." He paused. "Took me a while to understand those were supposed to be the same thing." He walked away. Wren stood in the thin March sun and looked north toward the mountains where the cabin was invisible from here, but known in the specific way that home is known even when you can't see it. She became aware of movement to her left. Silas Voss was standing 20 feet away on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands. He was looking at her with the look of a man who has something to say and knows the saying won't change what he deserves and has decided to say it anyway. She walked toward him. Callum stayed where he was. She stopped 3 feet from her father and looked at him. He looked at her. He looked at all of her with the attention of someone registering evidence of change and time, and his face did something complicated and then resolved into something simpler and more honest. "You look well," he said. "You look like your mother." Wren said nothing. "I'm not asking for anything," Silas said. "I want to be clear about that. What I did in there, I'm not asking for credit for it. I'm not asking for anything." He turned his hat over in his hands. "I'm leaving Harwick, heading east. I don't expect that to matter to you." Wren was quiet for a moment. "It matters," she said. He looked at her. "Not in the way you're hoping it does," she said. "But what you did in there matters. I watched you." She looked at her hands briefly and then back at him. "My mother died thinking she had failed you. She told me once that she'd failed you, that she couldn't find the right way to reach you." She paused. "I want you to know that I don't believe that anymore. I think she did everything that could be done. The failure was yours, not hers." The words were neither cruel nor soft. They were accurate, delivered without embellishment the way Wren delivered accurate things. Silas Voss's jaw tightened. He nodded once. "You're right," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Then I hope you do better," she said. "Somewhere else. I hope you find a way to be better than you were." He put his hat on. He straightened the brim with the care of a man who needs something to do with his hands. "Goodbye, Wren," he said. "Goodbye," she said. He walked away down the boardwalk and around the corner and out of her sight, and she stood in the March sunlight for a moment and let that be what it was. Then she turned and walked back to Callum. He read her face. She shook her head slightly. Not a negation. The gesture of someone shaking off water after coming in from rain. "Let's go home," she said. They were married 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning in the Harwick church when the light came through the east windows and lay in long, even rectangles across the floorboards. The minister was a short, earnest man named Aldrich, who performed weddings with the genuine conviction of someone who believed entirely in what he was doing. Sheriff Crane stood with Wren because there was no one else to stand with her, and because he had offered and she had accepted with the practicality that characterized how she accepted most things, and that practicality moved him more than ceremony would have. Nora Holt sat in their front pew. She had come back from her sister's house in Beaumont 2 weeks earlier, with her arm healed and something settled in her eyes that had not been there before. She had found a room above the dry goods store and had been in conversation with the building's owner about what a room above a dry goods store could become with the right intention behind it. Aldrich from Garfield's was there. Eli Marsh was there, newly employed and sitting in the back row with his hat in his lap and the expression of someone who has recently found themselves somewhere decent after a long time somewhere that was not. Callum wore his one good shirt. Wren wore a dress she had sewn herself from the fabric he had bought her in October, the fabric that had been waiting in her room for an occasion equal to it. The dress was simple and precise, and she wore it the way she wore everything, with a practicality that accidentally became something else. The minister asked if there was any objection. The room was quiet. The only man who might have objected was somewhere east of Harwick, with a long reckoning ahead of him. The only other man who had considered it was in Cheyenne thinking about lawyers. The minister continued. When it was done, Callum looked at Wren, and she was already looking at him, and she looked like herself, which was the thing he valued most about her. Not transformed, not performing something for the people in the room, just herself standing in a church in a dress she had made in a life she had built out of materials that by rights should not have been sufficient. Looking at him with those gray eyes that had never learned to lie, even when lying would have been considerably more convenient. "How does it feel?" he said quietly. She thought about it. "Like something that was always going to be true, finally being allowed to be true," she said. He understood that precisely. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon, just the two of them, Soot carrying double without complaint, because Soot had developed over the winter a philosophical tolerance for human complexity that he had not possessed in October. The cabin was as they had left it, fire banked low, the main room with the table in the right place, and the 2 chairs and the shelf with books, and the dried winter berries in the tin cup that Wren replaced when they faded. The back room, which had been hers and was now theirs, with the door that latched from the inside, and the window that faced east and caught the morning light first. Callum built the fire back up. Wren stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it, at all of it, the way you look at something when you are trying to fix it in memory, because memory is not always reliable, and some things deserve to be remembered exactly. "I used to think that getting through was the whole ambition," she said. "Get through today. Get through this season. Get through whatever was coming next." He waited. She turned and looked at him. "I didn't know there was another side," she said. "I thought the other side was just more getting through. I didn't know you could come out the far end of something and find that it actually ended." He crossed the room and she looked up at him. "It took me a long time too," he said. "What changed it?" "You," he said. She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in their cabin while the fire built back up, and the evening light shifted outside, and the mountain made its familiar sounds around them. Spring came to the mountain in April, reluctant as it always was, and then committed all at once the way Wyoming spring always eventually made up its mind. Snow retreating up the slopes to the heights where it lived year-round. The creek running loud and purposeful with melt. The ground under the trees beginning to soften and release the particular smell of earth returning to itself. Wren planted the garden. She had spent the winter planning it with the systematic focus she brought to everything that mattered to her, reading the sections of the farming book on mountain soil and altitude and short growing seasons until she could have written them herself. She had ordered seeds through the Harwick Mercantile potatoes, carrots, beans, 3 varieties of herbs, and a squash that the seed catalog claimed was specifically developed for high elevation and early frost, which she had decided to believe. She broke the ground herself over 3 days, working the rocky Wyoming soil with the methodical patience of someone who has internalized that the difference between good work and poor work is almost always just the willingness to continue when the task stops being interesting. Her back ached by the end of each day, and she was back at it the following morning. Callum built her a fence against the deer. 4 feet of split rail that took him a week and produced something he was quietly proud of in the way of a man who has built a thing properly. When the seeds were in, Wren stood at the edge of the turned soil and looked at it. "What if nothing grows?" she said. "Then we figure out what we did wrong and try again next year." That's not reassuring. It's accurate. Which matters more? She gave him the dry look that had become one of his favorite things about her. She turned back to the garden. "They'll grow," he said. "You care about them. Things respond to being cared about." She was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at him, "I've been thinking about Nora." He waited. She said when she was here that she'd been thinking about doing something practical. A place. Somewhere women could go who needed time to get themselves sorted out. She turned. "I think we should help her do it." "We don't have much money to put toward it." "No, but we have other things. Information. Experience with the specific problem she's trying to solve. People we know who might contribute in various ways." She looked at him directly. "And I've been thinking about the women I used to see in Harwick when I was still living with my father. The ones with the careful faces. I knew what those faces meant. I was one of those faces." He was quiet. "We can't save everyone," he said, because it was true and also because he wanted to make sure she understood he was not refusing. "No," she said, "but we can help someone, and I need to do that. It's not generosity, it's something I need to do. Then we do it." She nodded and turned back to her garden, and the thing was settled between them the way things settled when both people had been paying the kind of attention that makes settling possible. The women came, not in any organized way and not in large numbers. Word moved through the specific underground network that exists among people who are in danger and need to know where safety is available. Moving the way water moves through rock, finding the paths that exist rather than making new ones. A young woman named Rebecca arrived in May with 2 small children and a story that Wren listened to for an hour without speaking. "You'll stay as long as you need to," Wren said when Rebecca finished. That was the whole of it. Rebecca stayed 3 weeks. When she left, she had a plan and money from the tin box on the high shelf, small, but enough to begin with. An older woman named Martha arrived in June on foot, 8 miles of it, because her husband had sold their horse for drinking money 2 weeks earlier. She had the specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing an unmanageable situation for so long that the management itself has become more depleting than the danger. She stayed 2 weeks and helped Wren with the garden and told stories about her life that sometimes made Wren laugh and sometimes made her go quiet and sometimes made her angry on Martha's behalf in a way that Martha found, she said, unexpectedly consoling. Nobody had been angry on her behalf before. She had not understood until now that that was something she'd needed. When Martha left for a city west of the mountains where she had a sister, she took Wren's hands in both of hers. "You have your mother's eyes," she said. "I don't know how I know that, but you do." Wren stood at the edge of the clearing and watched her go and left the tears on her face in the June sunlight. Nora Holt opened her boarding house in Harwick in July. She called it Holt House and painted the sign herself in an even careful hand. Barwell, the proprietor of the dry goods store next door, stopped by on her first day with a jar of honey from his wife's kitchen and said that he hoped she did well and that she should knock if she needed anything. She knocked twice in the first month. Both times he was useful. The network was not organized so much as it was emergent. People arriving independently at understandings that turned out to be shared. Aldrich at Garfield's, Barwell at the dry goods store. A woman at the church named Dorothea, who had been teaching Sunday school for 12 years and had spent those years quietly noting which families came in with the specific, careful arrangements that indicated something wrong at home. Sheriff Crane, who was beginning to understand that some of the work his job required needed infrastructure that hadn't existed until recently, and the infrastructure was being built on a mountain outside town by 2 people who hadn't been asked to build it. By September, the garden had produced more than 2 people could eat before it spoiled, and Wren was preserving the surplus in jars on the new root cellar shelves, and the cabin that had been one man's deliberate solitude had become something she didn't have a precise word for and didn't feel the need to name. One evening in late September, they sat on the rebuilt porch in the last of the day's warmth and watched the sky go through its changes, blue to amber, to the deep purple that arrived just before the stars. A year, she said. Close to it. She was quiet. Then are you sorry? About what? Anything. He thought about it in the honest way she had always expected him to think about things which he valued, because it made honesty feel like the default rather than the exception. The transaction itself, yes, he said. The fact that it was necessary. The fact that the world is the kind of place where it's necessary. He paused. Everything after that, no. Not a single morning of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Neither am I, she said. They sat while the stars came out slowly, and then all at once the way stars appear, and the mountain settled into its evening sounds, creek and pine, and the occasional voice of something wild and far away. After a while, she said, the girl I used to be, the one peeling an apple on that bench. She thought surviving was the best that could be expected. He waited. She was wrong, Ren said. She was scared, Callum said. There's a difference. I know, she said. That's what I mean. She was wrong because she was scared, not because she was broken or inadequate. She just didn't know there was anything beyond surviving. She was quiet. I think about her often. The girl on the bench. What do you think about her? Ren looked at the stars. I think she deserved better sooner, she said. I think she did the best she could with what she'd been given, and what she could do with what she'd been given was extraordinary, and no one ever told her that. She paused. I try to remember that when the women come here, that they're doing extraordinary things with what they have, that they need someone to say that, not as comfort, but as information. He looked at her profile against the dark sky, the line of her face, the way her eyes moved when she was thinking through something that mattered. You're extraordinary, he said. She made a sound that was not quite dismissal. I mean it, he said. What you've made of this, what you've made of yourself from the materials available. He paused. I came up here to be away from people. I thought that was the solution. I thought the world was the problem. He looked at the mountains above them in the dark. The problem was that I didn't know how to live in the world anymore. You showed me how to do that again. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. You showed me first, she said. They held each other's gaze in the way of two people for whom looking at each other has become a form of communication that doesn't require language. Then she looked back at the stars. I want to go into town tomorrow, she said. All right. Nora told me about a girl last week, the daughter of a man who farmed south of Harwick. She described her face. I recognized the description. She paused. I want to go find her. I want to sit near her and let her know that someone sees her. He waited. The way you saw me, she said, standing across the street. I want to do that for her. Not rescue her, not fix anything. Just let her know she's visible to someone. We'll go in the morning, Callum said. She nodded. They sat in the dark while the stars moved overhead with the slow certainty of things that are not watching, but are nonetheless present, and the mountain breathed around them with the indifferent permanence of mountains which outlast every human arrangement without trying. Morning came the way it always did, which was without asking whether you were ready and without caring either way. The sky was the particular Wyoming blue that had no compromise in it, clean and deep and going all the way up to where the atmosphere ended and something else began. Ren stood at the edge of the clearing while Callum saddled Soot and looked at the cabin the way she had looked at the stars the night before. The rebuilt porch square and solid, better than what had been there before. The chimney she had learned to repoint with her own hands, the mortar set between the stones, with the care of someone who understands that small imprecisions become large problems over time. The garden in its late-season state still producing at the edges where the frost hadn't yet reached the fence around it that Callum had built in a week and been quietly proud of. The window of the room that latched from the inside curtains she had sewn from the leftover fabric of her wedding dress moving slightly in the morning air. She thought about a bench outside a telegraph office, about a knife and an apple, and a long spiral of peel falling into the dust of an October street. About a door latch, about what it had meant to hear the sound of it engaging and to understand that she was the one who had engaged it. She thought about the $50 and about what $50 had bought and about how those two things were not the same thing at all. Then she went to the horse and Callum helped her up and she settled into the saddle and they rode down the mountain toward Harwick in the morning light side by side on the trail that had room for one and that they had always made room for two. Harwick appeared below them as they came around the last switchback, small and certain in the valley, with its smoke rising straight in the still morning air, and its main street laid out in the practical grid of a place that is still in the process of deciding what it will become. They rode in. On the bench outside the telegraph office, a girl sat alone. She was young, 19, maybe less. She had the posture of someone who has learned to minimize her presence. Shoulders slightly forward, hands folded in her lap, eyes down. She was not reading. She was not watching the street. She was simply sitting in the specific way of someone who has found that stillness attracts less than movement. Callum drew Soot up. Wren was already swinging down from the saddle. She handed him the reins without looking at him. He took them without speaking. She walked across the main street of Harwick, Wyoming in the October morning light, and the town moved around her and she moved through it. The girl on the bench did not look up as Wren approached. Wren sat down beside her. She didn't say anything immediately. She sat in the sunlight with the town going about itself around them, and she gave the girl time to register her presence without the presence being a demand. The way you sit near something frightened close enough to matter, still enough to be trusted, patient enough to let the animal decide. Then she said, "My name is Wren Mercer." The girl looked up. Her eyes had the specific caution of someone who has learned that people approaching usually want something from you. "I used to sit on this bench," Wren said. "About a year ago. I sat here and waited to find out what kind of trouble was coming." The girl said nothing, but she did not look away. "I want you to know something," Wren said. She said it in the same quiet, direct way she said everything now, without apology and without performance. "There are people in this town who will help you. Real help, not words, not intentions. Practical help, the kind that actually changes things. You don't have to say anything right now. You don't have to tell me anything about yourself." She paused. "I just want you to know that someone sees you. Because a year ago someone saw me, and I didn't know until it happened how much I needed it." The girl looked at her for a long moment. Her hands, which had been pressed together in her lap, slowly came apart. One finger at a time they released. "My name is Clara," the girl said. Her voice was very quiet. "Clara," Wren said. "It's good to meet you." Across the street, Callum Mercer sat on his horse in the October sunlight and watched his wife sit on a bench with a stranger, and the expression on his face was one he would not have known how to produce a year ago. Because a year ago he had not believed he was still capable of it. He believed it now. The sky above Harwick was the deep Wyoming blue with no compromises in it, and the mountains north of town stood as they always stood, patient and absolute, and keeping their own counsel. And the morning went on around all of them, the way mornings do, indifferent to the small, enormous things happening within them, carrying everything and noticing nothing, which was Callum had come to understand, not indifference at all. It was just the world doing what the world does, making room for whatever happened next.